Admonition the 36th. A cup of tea, with cake, encourages confidences. After that second unsettling visitation, we remained very much on guard, particularly when I was off site. Having the dogs was a comfort, even though they were extremely friendly. As I said to Sadie, people new to the site would have no idea that the hounds were smiling and barking out of excitement to see them, rather than warning them off. But despite our caution and the dog's enthusiasm, we learned very quickly that Dunnans, and sometimes even its new inhabitants, excited a great deal of good-natured curiosity. There were locals who turned up to say hello, check we were okay, and nose a bit, like Bogey or KP. Then there were holiday-makers who wandered over the bridge in a state of bucolic wonder that such a place could ever exist, and who wanted to see as much as we would allow. And finally, there were those who were connected to the place in some way. And it was often this latter group who were to provide us with both useful information and, in the long run, a modicum of comfort. I want to say they were driving a Metro. It was certainly a small car with good visibility, and Metros in their earlier incarnations were certainly that. It wasn't any bigger, and it was labouring. The engine, I mean. That, of course, adds to the conviction, as Metros didn't have very big engines. And the engine, it rattled, as the drivers struggled with the very uneven surface of our unimproved drive, as well as what I soon gathered was a full complement of passengers. I say all this because, as their electric blue car emerged from behind the Lalandiae, bounced past the turning to the red shed, and then vanished behind the bank of overgrown ponticum towards the front of the castle, I had the distinct impression of the car's driver and 3 passengers. Through the large side windows I saw, as if caught by a telephoto lens, the shape of 4 statuesque ladies, each of a certain age, and each with a coloured rinse through their solidly coiffured hairdos. They were a veritable rainbow of thatch, crowded into what was evidently a very small space. I don't know whether I imagined it, but the 2 ladies on the back seat had their handbags on their laps, their hands clasped over the bag's clasps, and handle loops over their wrists, lips pursed. As I say, I was probably imagining it. I stood on the step at the door of our ever-evolving chalet for a moment, possibly displaying a quizzical expression on my face given the vision I had just witnessed, or more likely annoyance that the progress of my day was being interrupted again. I set my cup of tea down on the step, which was a mistake because both of the Bassets loved a cup of set-down tea, and took myself off to greet our visitors, whoever they were. As I rounded the courtyard turret to the front of the castle, I found aforesaid blue Supermini disgorged of its cargo, and aforesaid cargo striding about in what I can only describe as a peremptory manner. Now, before I go any further, I should mention that these ladies were well turned out, as if for a Sunday drive prior to lunch, or even church. They had that air of smartness, of correctness, that I, in my dog-eared black polo shirt, worn brown corduroy cargo trousers, and steel toe-capped work boots couldn't possibly contend with. However, sensing that this was an encounter rather than a curious sightseeing expedition, I ignored my sartorial disadvantage and jumped in. "Hello there, how can I help you?" At my words, the 4 spun to face me, each with clutched handbag, each with eyes narrowed and lips pursed. "Help us?" the foremost lady replied, in a voice that would have dropped a salvager of architectural relics at 100 paces. "I am not sure you can." She looked me up and down with a certain amount of disdain. "Where is the owner?" "I am the owner," I said. "Well, along with my wife Sadie. I'm Charles, pleased to meet you all." I continued smiling. "Indeed?" The foremost glanced at my hand disdainfully. I'm not sure at this point any of them were convinced of the fact of my ownership either. "And did you allow this to happen?" She gestured at the ruined castle, a look of outrage on her face. "Oh, by no means. We came here in March, well after the fire, which happened a couple of years ago now." "Oh?" said she of the foghorn voice. "And what do you intend to do with it, young man?" This was another of the ladies. She was slightly shorter than the loud one, with a more mollifying tone and a gentler hue of mauve for her rinse. I smiled. "Oh, restore it and live in it," I said airily. "Oh, well, that's a relief," said the third in a vibrant yellow. "What a relief, isn't it, Agnes?" Of course, there was an Agnes. She was the fourth, and she nodded vigorously, shaking her indigo coiffure, as the first inquired, "To live in?" I eyed her. "Well, not really sure yet." I paused, and then asked, "What is your interest in the building?" My primary interlocuteur readied herself, but was beaten to an answer, if answer it was to be, by her second, who said in a slightly breathless voice, "We used to live here." "You did? How wonderful! When?" The second said, "Oh, in the 50s and 60s. We were all in service to the Fletchers at one time or another." "You were? No wonder you were aghast to see the place now." "Indeed," replied Foghorn, who I realised I could no longer keep thinking of as Foghorn, and so introduced myself again, and finally gained their names as Iris, Matilda, Una, and Agnes, in that order. Still, seeing that Iris was not convinced, I invited them all in for a cup of tea and a chat with myself and Sadie. That melted all reserve. The ladies were particularly tickled with Sadie's knowledge of all things Fletcher. We learned much about life in the castle with the family, and were later to find Iris and Agnes's names scribed into doors when we recovered them from the house. We had several subsequent visits from the Metro girls, and each time I was quizzed at length on progress. The completion of the renovation of the house in 2007 was a great deal of comfort to all of them, particularly as we then had a proper kitchen to make a tea and proper sofas on which to entertain our very distinguished guests.